Hi everyone, thanks for joining today's webinar, Visualization and Dashboard Design Best Practices. This webinar is part of our webinar series, Talk Data to Me, which is aimed to provide tips, tricks, and how-tos to make you Tableau savvy. My name is Megan Fay, and I'm part of the marketing team here at Tableau. I'll be your moderator. Also helping out on the call today are Hugh Nguyen and Patrick Vanderhyde from the Tableau support team. Just a few quick housekeeping items before we get started. All lines are currently muted. If you have a question, please use the Q&A window and we'll get to questions at the end if time allows. A recording of this webinar and a copy of the slide deck and workbook will be emailed out after the webinar. And with that, I'd like to introduce our presenter today, John Duggar. John has spent the last 15 years working with big data, with the more recent years as a team lead for Global Channel Pre-Sales team here at Tableau. He is a purist and practice artisan in the art of visual best practices and is an expert in marrying the story of data and explaining how the human brain works. In this session, he'll be discussing visual best practices you can use when designing your interactive dashboards in Tableau. John, take it away.
Thank you, Megan. Hey, let's go ahead and get started pretty quickly. I have a lot of content that I would like to walk through in a very short amount of time to cover it. So with that, we'll jump right in and begin our conversation on visualization and dashboard best practices. But first, we'll have a little blurb from legal. The presentation is not complete without some words from our attorneys. This presentation could contain some proprietary information, and keep in mind that you could be under a non-disclosure agreement or other agreements within Tableau, so keep that in mind. If you do get a copy of this presentation, please consider keeping that inside of the partner ecosystem. All right, with that being said, let's go through the agenda real quick. What is a dashboard? That'll be the first thing that we cover. You may not have even thought about that. You may think that a dashboard is just a lot of graphs or visualizations on a single screen, and in some cases that is correct, but it's much deeper than that. So we'll get into that definition of a dashboard. We'll categorize dashboards as well. There's three main flavors of dashboards. We'll go through each one of those. We'll talk about the common mistakes and kind of illuminate those in a Tableau story point story. We'll talk about the principles of visual perception. Vision is our most powerful sense, and we're going to learn today how to take advantage of visual perception to design dashboards that are easy to digest and create rapid perception and introduce outliers in a way that's very clean and clear. We'll also critique some very bad designs. You'll actually put some of this new knowledge to use, and we'll show some very ugly dashboards, and we will show you exactly why those are ugly. You may have thought they were beautiful at one point, but after this presentation, I think you'll see that they all have mistakes. And then at the very end, I have some recommended reading for each of you. If you want to get good at creating dashboards, you have to put in the time. So it's practice as well as reading and learning from the experts. All right, so what is a dashboard? Rather than reinventing the wheel and creating my own definition, I thought I would just steal one from Stephen Few. He is the thought leader on dashboard design best practices. So there's some important notes to take away from this particular definition, and that's that dashboards are visual displays. They do include text, but the emphasis is going to be on graphics because graphs communicate data very, very efficiently. And we can take it in quickly, and our brains can interpret the most important meaning from the data using graphs. Another important point in this definition is that dashboards display only the information that is needed to achieve specific objectives. So dashboards should be objective-oriented, 3 to 5 objectives. If you don't keep a dashboard or a set of dashboards tied to specific objectives, they end up what I like to call boiling the ocean, right? So they're very confusing. There's a lot of stuff going on, lots and lots of different questions being answered in many, many different ways. But at the end, it's a very confusing dashboard or set of dashboards. So keep them tied to objectives. Dashboards you should be able to monitor an effective dashboard at a glance. So really anything can be displayed on a dashboard, but one characteristic that's common amongst all dashboards is that they show abbreviated summaries of data, both large and small. It's very difficult to monitor all the detail needed to achieve your objectives, but a dashboard must be able to quickly point out that something needs your attention or your action. So really, to sum it up, at a glance, a dashboard should be able to tell you that you should act on something. So categorizing dashboards, there's really three main categories. One is strategic, and these are typically your high-level summaries of the most important information. And typically, these are static snapshots of data. This would be something that an executive would want to look at, or a VP would want to look at each morning they get to their office. They want to take a quick look at their strategic dashboard and get a finger on the pulse very quickly. Operational dashboards are immediate by nature. They're used to monitor activities that are constantly changing, such as sales or profits, or maybe a computer farm with memory and CPU and other statistics around the hardware. Last but certainly not least is your analytical dashboards. These offer rich comparisons, drill down capabilities, what-if scenarios. These are 80% of the time, this is the type of dashboard that you're going to create with Tableau software. Analytical dashboards are highly interactive. So let's take a look at one real quick. This is the strategic dashboard that contains only the most important information for maybe a sales manager to monitor. And if we look at the visual highlights of this dashboard, notice that color is used sparingly and that the prime real estate has been used for the most important data, which is in the upper left-hand corner, which is our key metrics year to date. Anywhere you see the color red, it means something is bad. So if you look at this dashboard very quickly and rapidly, you can see that the areas that are problems for your company. And that's the key with a strategic dashboard. The next example is an operational dashboard. So this dashboard allows you to quickly see daily sales and profit activities. You can see the top products, today's orders, and the last 7 days sales. You can also see performance metrics by region, as well as sales and profit over time. And remember, the goal of an operational dashboard is to immediately monitor activities. And in this case, it's our sales and profit activities. That leads us into our analytic dashboard. So in this particular case, it could be an analyst whose work supports the marketing efforts of a company's hotels. So maybe this analyst is monitoring booking trends to identify seasonality and maybe opportunities to interest customers during slow periods. So once again, in this dashboard, and what you'll see common amongst all great dashboards is that color is used very effectively and the data is organized on the screen in a very clear and concise way. So the color is used sparingly on this dashboard as well. So if you look at the color orange, it's telling you that something is not so great. We're looking at total revenue in many different ways over time in a line chart. We're also looking at rooms sold versus available in a bullet chart in the middle of the screen. And then in a heat map at the bottom, we're looking at that revenue seasonality. So over the 12-month period, January through December, what does our revenue look like? And you can see very quickly that in September through November, revenue is not so great. In fact, it's really low. So that leads you to think, why? Why is revenue low? If you look at the regions in this dashboard, you'll see it's Mexico, the Dominican, Jamaica, the Caribbean. Well, it's hurricane season, and people don't tend to visit these places during hurricane season. So maybe the marketing analyst could create some kind of work with the campaign people and create a campaign that would attract customers during these slow periods so that our revenue doesn't take a huge hit during these slow months. Let's move on to the next screen. All right, so let's talk about some common mistakes. We see a lot of mistakes in dashboard design, and we're just going to illuminate some of the top mistakes that we see by using Tableau story points. So in this case, we're fragmenting information, which happens to be mistake number one. This is a very common thing where, in this case, we're fragmenting in a couple of different ways. We have a scroll bar on the right side. Remember that scroll bars are the enemy in dashboard design. You do not want scroll bars if you can at all help it. They're very distracting, and it really fragments the information. We also have a scroll bar down here on the profit by category bar chart. And in another way that we're fragmenting the information in this particular dashboard is that we're having to choose a metric using this parameter-driven drop-down, which is okay, but maybe you want to be able to compare all of your important metrics on a single screen. And the way this dashboard is designed, you can't, right? You have to pick one metric at a time and analyze that information on the map and on the trend line. So a potential solution to this problem is arranging all of your data on a single screen with no scroll bars, and then presenting your most important metrics on a small multiple display, which is essentially the same graph presented multiple times, but is broken up by different dimensions. In this case, it's regions. So very quickly, we can see those trends across all of our most important metrics, and there's no scroll bars on this screen that will cause fragmentation of the data. Mistake number 2 is inadequate context. And by inadequate context, I have some screenshots of gauges. And now, of course, gauges don't provide great context. They're really bulky. They take up a lot of space on a graph. And Tableau makes it very, very difficult to create gauges. We definitely don't do it out of the box because it is not a best practice in terms of visualization. Some people like them, but do avoid them at all costs. So let's look at some solutions to inadequate context. I'm going to offer you up 3 different solutions so that you can use these in your dashboard design. If you're not familiar with bullet graphs, I recommend that you get familiar with them because it is absolutely the best graphical display to compare 2 measures against each other. In this case, we're comparing actual versus budgeted profit. So the bar itself is encoding our actual profit this year, and then the red reference line is encoding our budgeted profit. So we can see that we're not quite to our budgeted profit. In fact, we're $9,000 short. But we have some time left over, and we're in a good operating range. So the background color is essentially bad, okay, and good. So the dark gray is considered bad. So if that black bar was inside of that dark gray reference band in the background, you know you're in a bad spot. If it's in that middle gray shading, then you're in an okay spot. And if you're in this light gray area, then you're in good range. So you're doing okay. Also, looking at data over time, people typically just take a number like profit, and they'll roll it out over time and show it on a line graph, and that's okay. But a better and more contextual way of looking at profit is to compare that profit variance to the budgeted profit over time. So this particular graph shows the profit variance to budget, which you can see a huge decline in October. So we have a problem there. Just a little bit of a different way of looking at the data, but it really breathes a lot of life into the information that it's presenting to you. So part 2 of 3 of inadequate context is adding a trend indicator to quickly breathe life into the number. Right? So that number by itself, 780K, let's pretend that downward red triangle is not on the screen. If you had a dashboard that had that number, then you would probably think, is 780K good? Is it bad? How does it compare to last year? What's the trend? All these questions are popping up in your head, and they're all valid questions, and a number by itself doesn't give you that information. But just with a simple trend indicator, a triangle, you can see as you hover over that 780K is in fact our overall profit, but our month-over-month profit growth is declining 97%. So we do have a problem. Let's move on and look at part 3 of inadequate context. And this is another example of breathing life into an ordinary basic number by just adding a quick spark line or some kind of a visual cue to give you an idea of the context of the number. So here you can see the 12-month trend for profit, and the orange circles are giving you the high and low points for the profit over that 12-month period. So we can see towards the end of the year, we're spiking up around the holidays, and then in the earlier parts of the year, we're definitely lower in our profit. Mistake number 3 is excessive detail. Remember, the dashboards should be created to adhere to our pre-attentive thought processing, and that numbers should be at a very high level. You don't need precision on a dashboard most of the time. When I say precision, I'm talking about decimal points. You don't need 2, 3, or 4 precision points after a decimal. And if you look at this dashboard, we're trying to label the city-state combinations with the profit numbers. In the timeline, the trend chart, we're actually looking at the exact date, which causes a lot of data points to be shown and mapped on that line chart. All these things cause visual confusion. And by simply adding some dashboard best practices to this dashboard, we clear it up immensely. So we take off the labels on the map, we truncate the labels on our bars, we truncate the sales, profit, and the profit ratio numbers on our detail table to the nearest whole number. And then on the sales timeline, we're looking at the month-year combination. So that really clears up the timeline so you can see the overall flow of this data as it runs through the time. So very simple tips to clean up a dashboard. So moving on to mistake number 4, inappropriate display media. In this example, we're going to pick on our poor friend, the pie chart. He tends to get no love at Tableau, but very few times does a pie chart really and effectively communicate information in a clear way. So without the labels on the pie chart below, if I asked you to rank order the customer segments by the % of sales contribution, you would automatically know that corporate is number 1. Clearly, that is the largest wedge in this pie. But the 3 remaining pieces, consumer, small business, and home office, they're relatively the same. Now, we could hover over, we could get a tooltip that will tell us what that is, but this is not rapid perception. So you'll be playing the guessing game, trying to rank order 2nd, 3rd, and 4th place on this particular pie chart. Whereas if we encoded this exact information with a bar chart, it's very easy to rank order these customer segments. Corporate is in first place, followed by home office, small business, and consumer. We could also add a reference line to this chart, maybe that would show the average % of total sales, and you could see very quickly which segments are above or below that reference line. So bar charts cater to our pre-attentive thought processing. They're perceived very, very rapidly in our brains. We don't even really have to think about it. It just happens. We'll talk about pre-attentive thought processing a little bit later in the presentation. Mistake number 4 is inappropriate display media. So in this case, we're encoding trends over time with bar charts. So we have budgeted sales as the yellow color, and we have sales as the blue. I think we'll all agree that this does not really encode the overall shape of the data as it flows through time. It's not very effective as it would be if it was encoded with a line. So really the rule of thumb, when you're encoding information over time, use a line chart. A line chart does a very effective job at showing you this information as it flows through time. So another one that we see very often in dashboard design is meaningless variety. I think people think that folks will get bored, for example, if they have data in hand that is begging to be encoded with a line chart, for example. If you have nothing but data over time, people think that you're going to get bored with that. So they'll start creating or even inventing new chart types, like this chart in the middle here, this circle within a circle. I don't even know what you would call that, but it's not very effective, right? I mean, this information would be much more effective if they were all encoded with a line chart. So you're not going to bore people if you're giving them the information in a way that they can rapidly perceive. Now, if you give people information in this manner, where you just assume they're going to get bored because a line chart is quote-unquote boring, then you're flat wrong. People will get tired of seeing a dashboard like this where their brains have to work extra hard to decode the information that the graphs are trying to tell them. So to solve this, as I said, just encode the data with the correct graph that the information is telling you to encode it with. So if you're looking at data over time, then it's perfectly acceptable to create a dashboard with nothing but line charts on it. There's nothing wrong with that. It's a very clear and concise way to map out this information. Mistake number 6 is poorly designed display media. And in this case, we have a 3D bar chart, which actually 15 years ago is probably one of my favorite visualization types. I thought it was really cool. But the problem with this chart is if I ask you a question like, hey, what was the average monthly temperature in Boston in November of 1960? You couldn't answer that because this chart suffers from occlusion and you can't see those bars way back there in the back. So the way we can design around this with a tool like Tableau is we can create a heat map that is encoding 100 years of Boston average monthly temperatures all on a single screen. So very quickly you can scan through this and notice, first thing is that it's pretty consistent actually. There's some outliers, it looks like in November and April, but overall the last 100 years the average monthly temperature has been consistent. And nothing is occluded. You can see every record all on a single screen very clearly. Mistake number 7 is encoding data inaccurately. This is something that I see quite a bit actually, especially in journalism and in blogs. With people who want to sway your opinion on a particular topic, they can actually take advantage of graphs to manipulate them in a way that will sway your opinion. But if you look at this and I ask you what's wrong with this view, you might not notice from the get-go what's wrong with it. But if I said, okay, in January, how much larger is sales when compared to the cost of goods sold? You could kind of eyeball it and go, okay, so the cost of goods sold is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, maybe 6 times larger. So sales is 6 times larger than the cost of goods sold in January. But that's not true. Notice where the y-axis starts. It starts at 20K. It's not starting at 0. But notice what happens when we actually start that y-axis at 0. The graph is telling a completely different story now. Now the cost of goods sold is roughly, I don't know, 2.5 times smaller than sales. So a very big difference, and all we did was manipulate the start point of the y-axis. Now by default in Tableau, the y-axis always starts with 0. You have to manually go in and tell it not to do that. But keep that in mind. Always start your charts with an axis value at 0. Mistake number 8 is arranging data poorly or bad visual design. This is a very, very common dashboard that we see out there in the wild. And that Tableau actually makes it pretty easy to develop poor dashboards like this, because if you think about the workflow of developing a dashboard in our software is you develop worksheets which are independent of each other. And then at the very end, when you want to wrap your analysis up, you want to drop it on a single screen. And that's all it is a simple drag and drop exercise. And this is the end result. So we have views that are placed rather randomly on a single screen, and it's very hard to rapidly perceive what these views are trying to tell you. And for the rest of these mistakes, we're going to wrap them up in an overall solution. So mistakes, I believe it's 8 through 12, we'll have a final solution for them. So mistake number 9 is ineffective highlighting. And in this case, everything is bright and bold. So what catches your eye in this dashboard? And the answer is nothing, because everything is visually prominent, which causes sameness. And sameness is not a great thing on a dashboard. You want that dashboard to show you the information that needs your attention quickly in a very effective and fast way. And on this dashboard, it's absolutely impossible because we have so many different bright and bold colors that everything kind of looks the same. Mistake number 10 is useless decoration. And as you can see, I didn't develop this one in Tableau. I just took a screenshot of a competitor's dashboard and threw it on here, but there's a lot of mistakes on it. So thinking about decoration, people like to dress up their dashboard with quirky things like sparkles and glitter and exploding pie charts and gauges and pictures, for example, gradient backgrounds. All of these things might be appealing to a normal user, but it's going to eventually get boring. It's distracting from what needs your attention, which is the data. And the big takeaway from this is don't do it. Just stay away from any of these things that you see on this particular dashboard. It's all pretty bad. Mistake number 11 is a very, very common one that we see out there, and that is the misuse or overuse of color. And color is a very powerful way of highlighting data that needs your attention, but it's also a great way of making a dashboard very difficult to digest and consume. And in this case, I'll just ask you a question. Would you want to look at this dashboard each and every day? Probably not, because you're not getting anything out of it. It's not really telling you a story. So let's dig into the misuse or overuse of color just really briefly. And I'm going to show you 3 different ways to use color, going from bad to best practice. So bad is encoding each categorical element with a bar that the bar is encoding. So small box is clearly the top bar. You don't need to encode that with a color. The user already knows that is its own independent element, its own bar. Coloring each of the bars with a categorical element just adds an additional layer of processing that has to happen in your brain, and that causes confusion. So a better way of encoding color to your bars is simply by using a natural color palette to the bars themselves. Have them all uniform using the exact same color palette. But an even better way of using color on a bar chart is to color encode something that needs your attention with a very bright and bold color. So in the third bar chart example, you can see that the tan color is a profit margin is okay, and then the orange is an alert. We've got some issue with our profit margin. So we're going to color that one a really bright, bold color so it jumps off that page and really gets your attention quickly. So let's look at the overall solution to mistakes 8 through 11. So this is kind of putting everything together in a dashboard that's adhering to some best practices. So in this case, we've got the Superstore data set. We have our most important metrics laid out at the top. This is what I call our 30,000-foot view. And then the next layer down, we've got our departmental metrics. And then we can see that information on a map as well. This is also highly interactive. We can click on furniture, for example. Maybe I'm the furniture manager, and I'm only concerned with the furniture metrics. So now we're looking at a furniture dashboard. And I can see that from Missouri all the way up to Minnesota, we've got some issues with our profitability as well as in Florida. So I might want to drill in even further to analyze the next level in, which is the product subcategory, to see what subcategories are performing in these particular states or regions, to really drill in to figure out what's causing this unprofitable behavior in these certain states. But notice once again, the color is used very, very wisely. The data is laid out very cleanly on the screen, and anywhere you see the color red, we've got a problem. All right, mistake number 12, massive crosstabs with too many quick filters. This is a mistake that we see from really from people with like a traditional BI background. And in traditional BI products, crosstabs are kind of the norm. And what typically happens is you create these crosstab reports, people can download them, they'll bring them into Excel, create some pivot tables and whatnot, and it's a very clunky process. And not only is it a clunky process, but crosstabs by their very nature are not easily perceived, so you don't get a lot of insight out of a crosstab. And finally, in Tableau, crosstabs can be very non-performant. It's lots of marks on your screen. You've got these quick filters that create unnecessary querying to the underlying data source. It's just not a great user experience creating these massive crosstabs. But the good news is there's different solutions to the massive crosstab problem, and one of those solutions is what we call guided analysis. So in this particular case, we start at the highest level of aggregation in our data, which in this case is our department, and then we filter into a lower level of information, which is the subcategory, and then finally the individual item. Each of these views will filter the subsequent views that come after it. So if you look at the title of each of these views on the dashboard, it has a number. Well, that number is simply the number of rows in that particular view. So we can see in our crosstab, it's fairly large. We have about 5,000 rows in our detail view. But that, you can't analyze that, right? I mean, there's no insight that you can really derive out of this huge crosstab. But by using visual filtering and identifying things that need our attention, then we can filter that crosstab down to a much more manageable view, and then we can kind of make smart decisions from that. So for example, furniture, I can see that is the least profitable at $107,000. So I'm going to select furniture. It's going to filter my other views. So now my crosstab has 1,000 rows. I can see that tables is by far our least profitable subcategory. We're losing $28,000 on our tables. I click tables. It's going to filter our items, our map, and our crosstab. It's getting smaller. And I can see that we're losing a lot of money on these bullnose wood conference tables. Now if I click that, now we've got a much more manageable detailed view. We can see all the customers, where they made the purchase of these Chromecraft bullnose tables, and I can get their order details as well. This is a much more performant and a visual best practice way of analyzing information. Okay, so let's play the number game. I'm sure you've played this before, but if you haven't, it's pretty compelling actually. So if I asked you to scan this table full of numbers and count the number of times the number 5 appears, you can do it, but it's going to take you a while because it's going to involve what we call attentive processing. So this list of numbers does not exhibit any pre-attentive attributes that you could use to distinguish the number 5s from any of the other numbers in this list. Right? Numbers are complex by nature. Their shape is complex. So if I switch over to the next screen, and all we did was apply a pre-attentive attribute to it, so we just bolded those number 5s, you can count these very, very quickly because this is pre-attentive thought processing. So changing the hue or the color of a number is a pre-attentive attribute, and pre-attentive processing occurs extraordinarily fast in the human brain. So this results in certain things standing out and a particular set of objects being grouped together, all without conscious thought. So attentive processing is sequential, and therefore it's much, much slower. Let's play another game. Easy little crosstab of information, but it's going to be very difficult to answer a simple question from this crosstab. And that's because our short-term memory is extremely limited. So asking the question, have we gained or lost customers over the last 4 years? Or which city has grown the fastest? I mean, you're going to be able to figure it out, but it takes a great deal of mental processing to arrive at that answer. Whereas if we encoded this visually with a line graph, it's very easy to see the answer to our questions. So by engaging our visual perception, which is our most powerful human sense, it's easy to answer these questions of the data. So vision is by far our most powerful sense, but to really understand how to create dashboards that take advantage of this visual perception, we need to learn a little bit about the scientific side of visual perception. And we're going to learn what works, what doesn't, and why next. All right, so short-term memory. Number one, it's limited. So we can only store around 3 to 9 chunks of visual information at a time in our short-term memory. And when that capacity is full for something new to be brought into our short-term memory, then something there must either be moved into long-term memory or it's simply removed altogether. And that means it's forgotten. And we definitely don't want that to happen. We want the key metrics to be very rapidly perceived and present it in a way that's going to enhance our thought processing. So for example, individual numbers on a dashboard are stored as discrete chunks of information, but a well-designed graphical pattern like the pattern formed by one or more lines on a line graph can represent a great deal of information as a single chunk. And this is one of the great advantages of graphs over text. So there are 4 categories of pre-attentive attributes, and that is color, form, position, and motion. And we're just going to go through, I'm going to give you some examples of these. So color. Hue is a more precise term for what we normally think of as colors, so red, green, blue, purple, etc. So we're physically changing the color of one of those circles, makes it stand out from the other circles, right? It's different. So that's our outlier. And the same with intensity. Intensity is really, it really refers to both saturation and lightness. It's not really a different hue, but a lighter version of the same hue. But you can see the end result is very similar, and that particular circle really jumps off the screen and grabs your attention. And that's the power of pre-attentive processing, is that you can design dashboards that take advantage of these, and your users will be able to scan a dashboard and get insight out of it very, very quickly without their brains having to work overtime to get that information out. It's just going to happen. And they won't even know that you design your dashboard in this way. It's just, it works. So in terms of form, orientation, line width, line length, shape size, and enclosure are all pre-attentive attributes of form. So if you look at those graphics, you can easily see the outliers, and that's because they are pre-attentive. The next one is 2D location. So that little circle that's kind of fallen off the table there, very clearly, that's different than the other 3 that are nice and lined up in a row. And last but not least is motion. So in this case, flicker. Flicker is an attribute of motion, but you need to be very careful with flicker. You know, clearly this red dot will get your attention. If I press the play button on this, it's going to flash red and go away. It's just flashing at you, but if you can imagine, 10 or 15 of these things on your dashboard blinking at you when a KPI is not met, it can get rather annoying, but it's definitely a pre-attentive attribute. All right. So let's look at a before and after on a dashboard here. So this particular dashboard was created to showcase our Amazon Redshift connector. It was new a few years ago, and this is a dashboard that somebody had pulled together to showcase that connector. The problem with this dashboard is it really doesn't tell a story, right? There's 3 graphs on a single page. There's a scroll bar on the color legend. There's bright and bold colors all over the place, but there's no cohesiveness to it. There's no story to it, so it's rather boring. But applying some visualization best practices, we can take the exact same data set and we can create a dashboard that is very, very compelling. So if you look at this one, notice the title. So the title is where it really starts. So the sobering effects of drunk driving and how drunk driving impacted the victims in 2011. At the top, we've got your 30,000-foot view, which has your most important metrics displayed very easily and at a high level. And then you've got the map. And if you compare the map from the before, which was a filled map, it just doesn't have the same feel that a symbol map has. So each of these red circles is an accident or a fatality that involved a drunk driver. The gray circles are accidents that involved a drunk driver, but there was no fatalities. So very clearly you can see on that map the enormity of drinking and driving in the U.S. In fact, this is just 1 year. If we move over to the right, you can see the most dangerous states. And you see Texas, California, Florida. They're very dangerous when it comes to drinking and driving, when you're looking at the total numbers of fatalities and accidents. But when you boil it down to fatalities per 100,000 people, which is what you have in the bottom bullet chart, it's a completely different list of states. It's North Dakota, Montana, Wyoming, South Carolina, not necessarily the largest populated states, but in fact, the deadliest states are these states. These are the states you need to watch out for. Late nights are violent. You can see by the color red that those early morning hours, late at night, is when the majority of our fatalities happen, drinking and driving. You can see that the 4th of July and around Halloween, there are big spikes in drinking and driving. And of course, the weekends are killer. People out drinking and driving most frequently over the weekend. So applying some visualization best practices, choosing the right visual displays that will really hammer home the story that you're trying to tell, using titles effectively, using colors effectively, and arranging the data elements on the screen in an effective way, all result in a dashboard that's easy to consume and is enlightening. So let's look at the layout of a dashboard. There's definitely a good and bad for placing elements on a particular dashboard. And there's areas of the screen that get emphasized kind of pre-attentively as opposed to other areas that aren't emphasized. So if you're looking at a single screen, and that's what you're looking at here, the top left and the middle portions of the screen are the areas of emphasis. These are the areas that you're going to want to place your most important graphs, the graphs that are really going to hammer home the message that you're trying to tell. You're going to place them in these pieces of real estate on your screen. Now the bottom left and the upper right, they're neither emphasized nor are they de-emphasized. So that'll be kind of your secondary graphs that support your graphs that provide that emphasis. And then the bottom right is for your least important information. And what we typically see in dashboard design is in that upper left-hand corner, we see a big giant logo up there. And that's distracting because that's the first thing your eyes see, especially in the Western Hemisphere. We read from left to right, top to bottom. So naturally, when we see a page, our eyes go right up there to the upper left. And if you're seeing a big giant logo, then you're missing out on the data. So if you have to put a logo on your dashboard, place it in the lower right-hand corner. So digging in a little bit deeper on color, we won't get into a lot of the details of color. We could have a full day session on this, but here are some pointers. So bright colors cause sensory overkill. You reserve those bright, bold colors from data that should stand out from the rest. In other words, a KPI that's broken or something that's bad should be encoded with a really bright, bold color. Your brain naturally groups data by color. So if you had a bar chart and you're encoding, let's say, sales by region, you have 4 regions. Let's say the West region is red, which is not a best practice anyway. We're not supposed to encode the bars with the categorical element that the bar is encoding. But let's say we were. So the West region is red. Let's say your product category technology is also red on that same page. Your brain is going to try to group those two things together just because they're the same color. Even though they don't go together, your brain is going to do that naturally. Don't use red, yellow, and green on a dashboard, and this is simply because 10% of our population in general are red-green colorblind, so they're not going to see the red-green that you do. And finally, but definitely not least, use colors that are common in nature for your overall color palette on your dashboard, and then use those emphasis colors to really bring the light to outliers that need your attention. If you can take advantage of these simple rules, then you will not be, colors won't be rampant and bright and bold and causing confusion on your dashboard. Be very clear and concise. So this is an example of 2 forms of red-green color blindness. Protanopia and deuteranopia. If you're looking at the chart in the middle, this is what somebody with normal color vision would see. So here's the green, here's the red, and then protanopia and deuteranopia are 2 forms of red-green color blindness, and this is potentially what they would see, whereas you would see red and green, they're seeing different shades of yellows and browns. So just kind of an idea, and there's going to be all types of the shades in between here, depending on your severity of color blindness, but this kind of gives you an idea of what somebody with a red-green color blindness would see if you're encoding things with red and green. A better color palette to get around that color blindness limitation is like an orange-blue. There's also colorblind palettes in Tableau by default. So we'll get into some best practices here. And the first one that I would like to talk about is the small multiples. So in a display of small multiples, the same basic graph appears multiple times. And by arranging multiple versions of the same graph next to one another, you can show the entire picture within an eye span. And this is very powerful because it makes making comparisons very, very easy. So here we have a small multiple display of a scatter plot. So no other display will show you this information in such a concise way, whereas we can see very quickly that in technology, on the customer segment, we have a very strong negative correlation between shipping cost and our profitability. Looking at the trend line makes that happen very quickly. So characteristics of great dashboards. So they're always well organized. If you look at any great dashboard out there, they're going to have these characteristics. And an exceptionally well organized dashboard is one that is just, it's clean, it's clear, it's really telling you a story that's very effective, and it's very, very easy to see. So always focus on organizing the information displayed on your dashboard. It will pay off in that end result. And how the pieces are arranged in relation to one another can make the difference between a dashboard that works and one that ends up being ignored. All right, so let's critique some very poor dashboard design, and let's look at some ways that these could be improved. So this particular dashboard is using red and green to encode in the bar chart, which they have a good idea in that the color red means something is bad, but using the colors red and green together it could affect that 10% of the population that could be consuming this dashboard, and that they couldn't see those colors very effectively. Looking at the pie chart, there's lots of wedges in this pie. They look roughly the same shape, same size. It's very difficult to get any information out of that. And if you look at the most important piece of real estate on this particular dashboard, which is this area up here, you've got the filters and you have this crosstab with a scroll bar. So that, I highly doubt that this is the most important piece of information on this dashboard, but based on where the creator placed it, it is. Let's look at another one. So what's wrong with this one? We've got a stacked bar in the upper left-hand corner, which is the most important piece of real estate. That stacked bar is probably not the best choice for rapid visual perception. And regional load is most likely not the most important graph on here. It might be the average cost per mile. I'm not sure, but that upper left-hand corner is definitely the most important piece of real estate on this dashboard. Also, the organization of this dashboard is a bit lacking, right? There's just a lot of views that are kind of randomly placed on it, and that causes unnecessary confusion as well. There's no flow to it. So what's wrong with this one? Well, once again, we have red, green, and yellow, which is very, very common in dashboard design. I think the reason for that is, I don't know, people think of a dashboard, maybe they think of a car. You think of a car, you think of a signal light. I'm not sure. The colors of signal light are red, green, and yellow, but definitely don't use those colors on your dashboard. There's a lot of wasted space on this. The use of gauges and trinkets are rampant throughout it. It's not adhering to our pre-attentive thought processing, and you can't monitor this at a glance, and that's the point of a dashboard. What's wrong with this one? So once again, look at the real estate being used. The most important piece of real estate is a filter. How do age and gender affect the way you spend money? There's scroll bars throughout the dashboard. It's almost too condensed. They need to get rid of those scroll bars. Color is not used very effectively. They're labeling the pie charts, et cetera, et cetera. It's not very well laid out. Lots of problems with this dashboard. So the recommended reading, like I said earlier in the presentation, if you want to get really good at creating these visual displays of information that we call dashboards, these are the books that I would highly recommend. Edward Tufte's Beautiful Evidence, Colin Ware's Information Visualization, and Stephen Few's Information Dashboard Design. And if I would recommend one and only one, then it would definitely be Stephen Few's books. This isn't the only book that he's written, but he tends to write in a way that anybody can understand and that you can take the information in his book and apply it to your everyday work very quickly. It is very powerful, and that's the way Stephen writes. So if you're like me, you'll have to read the book 3 or 4 times for it to finally sink in, but once it does, you'll be creating very clear and concise dashboards. The great news about this is that anybody can do it. It just takes a little bit of practice. So with that, I will turn it back over to Megan, and we can have a bit of Q&A.
Thanks, John. Great presentation. We do have time for some questions and answers. So if you have a question, please use the Q&A window and insert your question. We haven't had too many come in. So I will give everyone just a couple minutes to insert their questions. All right, we have one question come in. These are all great resources that you've given today, some great tips and this recommended reading. But do you have any other suggestions of places people can go to ask more questions about visual best practices and dashboard design?
Yeah, actually, Tableau's website is full of best practices and different blog postings from knowledge experts on this subject, as well as Stephen Few. Stephen Few has a website called perceptualedge.com, and that website is chock full of best practices and white papers around this topic as well. So I guess the answer is a quick Google search, and you'll get your answer.
Great. Next question is, if you put too many drill downs in a dashboard, is that a good practice or not?
I think it depends on the overall functionality of the dashboard. Each dashboard is so very different than the other. For drill downs, they can be very, very effective, but keep in mind the actual flow of analysis. If you have so many drill downs that the overall flow of an interactivity is disrupted, then it's probably too many. My recommendation on drill downs, or even in any kind of dashboard design, is once you have it designed and you're happy with it, send it to a few people and get their critique on it. Is it confusing to them? Because if it's confusing to them, it's going to be confusing to a broader audience. You may need to bring it down a little bit and not do so much drilling down. But do keep your dashboards objective-oriented. If you have them tied to specific objectives and detail out what those objectives are somewhere on the dashboard, maybe it's a help menu. If you look at this screen, I don't know if you can see the little triangle here. And this is actually not this is not very pertinent to this particular worksheet in Tableau, but this is a help menu. So on a dashboard, you could easily have like a little question mark in the upper right-hand corner, and you hover over it. It'll give you that overall understanding of what the dashboard is designed to do. You know, this dashboard is designed to answer questions A, B, C, and D. And it's interactive in that you can click on the bars, et cetera, or you can drill down by doing these things. So that way a new user who's never seen the dashboard can kind of get that real high-level understanding of what the dashboard was designed to do. So that's a little trick that I use on my dashboard. It's just a little help icon. And all this is another worksheet with a tooltip, and I floated that in the upper right-hand corner. So I hope I answered your question.
Yeah, that's a great tip. One question came in. Are there things to consider when designing dashboards that will only be consumed as a screenshot? So I know we we like people to look at dashboards interactively, being able to do actions and drill downs, but there's those instances where people do a quick screenshot, email it over. So do you have any suggestions of when people are building their dashboards, how to take that into account?
Now, naturally, being a Tableau pre-sales person, I would say Tableau server is your answer, and that really a static screenshot of a dashboard is rarely as effective as an interactive one, and Tableau server would definitely bridge that gap. But I do understand that there are cases where you just want to take a quick screenshot and email it over to somebody and say, hey, look, our profit is really bad in this region, check it out. In that case, I would make sure that on that particular dashboard, if it is a dashboard that it was designed for screenshots, that you have text in there that is used smartly that tells you exactly what these views are doing, right? Because you can't take advantage of a tooltip on a static screenshot. So maybe you have the title of the chart in like an 11 or 12 point font, and then underneath that, you would have some underlying information that gives you kind of the metadata of that particular chart. Another thing that you can do on a static screenshot of a dashboard is use the annotations. So annotations are a great way to get somebody's attention on something that is an outlier, right? Something that you wouldn't be able to find by interacting, but on a static screenshot, that annotation can be very, very meaningful.
Perfect, thank you. Another question, if you do have a colorblind audience, how can you design your dashboards with not compromising the colors that you're using? Do you have any recommendations for that?
Yeah, and I appreciate that question because that's something that most people don't even think about is, especially if you're not red-green colorblind, and that is the most predominant. There are other forms of colorblindness, but red-green is by far the most prominent. But if you're not suffering from that condition, you don't even really think about it. So I appreciate somebody asking the question about that because you do need to keep it in mind. So to answer the question, though, Tableau has colorblind palettes installed by default, but you can also use other palettes in Tableau as well. If I go to a new sheet here, let's just build a chart real quick and I'll show you. Let's see, market, we'll do cost of goods sold. I want to show you some of the palettes we have available. So maybe on this, we want to color and code it with profit, and it's defaulting to the green, which is okay, but it's a little difficult to see. Maybe we want to encode it with an orange-blue. I kind of default to an orange-blue palette when creating these dashboards so that our colorblind friends can decipher those. Also, if you look at a discrete color palette, we have a colorblind 10 right here. So you can use any of these in combination with each other so that our colorblind people can distinguish these from each other. But the big key takeaway is to really stay away from red and green together. Red and green really they pose a lot of challenges to those folks who are red-green colorblind.
I learn something new every day. I didn't know that the red-green colorblindness was most, I wouldn't want to say popular, but that's the majority of what people are suffering. Anyways, that's all we have time for today. John, I'd like to thank you for your time and this great presentation, and I'd like to thank all of you for joining today. As a reminder, we will email out a recording of this presentation as well as the deck John used. We hope you can apply what you learned today in your day-to-day work with Tableau. And with that, have a great day. Thank you.
Thank you.